I guess what I'll do is first say on the organization I'm now with, CIGI in Waterloo. I don't claim to be a climate guy. I haven't invested my life the way people like Gordon have in the subject. So I don't claim to know the details of the science. But through my work at IDRC and now at CIGI, I have an appreciation for the various issues related to climate, and I should say I also have the privilege, and Roy asked me to mention this, and I'm happy to be on a commission that Michael Spence and Joe Stiglitz chair, called the Commission on Global Economic Transformation. And as you might imagine from the title, one of the salients of streams of our work would be the impacts of climate on the environment and on society more broadly. So although I don't speak for CIGI or the Commission, I've been informed by its work, and I'm happy to do so. I guess my first point would be that, you know, Gordon and then Joanna last night made clear that by not doing anything, we're imposing costs on ourselves. And I say that as an economist, that not doing something imposes costs as well. So when someone says to you, but this will cost money to do, like your $100 valve, well, you have to weigh that against the costs of not doing it. And so that's kind of self-evident. But the example that comes up, the low-hanging fruit, and again, we heard it last night, is fossil fuel subsidies, right? I mean, what's the point of actually spending money on making things worse in some ways? Except, you know, again, I'll say, there might be some cases where you want to do it. In extremely poor countries, if you want to subsidize public transport, I can see that. But if you remove that factor, then the fact still remains that we have a political economy issue that needs to be addressed. And so I'm going to sort of talk about 5 things which I think we can do at the national, and particularly in my case, since I'm in the global governance space, the international level, that will get us to where we are. I've also been asked to sort of give you good news and not just bad news. And so I have one piece of good news here, which is when we look at the technological advance that is happening in this area, it is quite impressive. And so I'll come to that in a second, but the gist of what I'm going to say is that the supportive policies that we need to make this, to give this octane, could be strengthened. And so I'm going to give you 5 examples of that. Let me begin with probably what's a chapeau. I'm going to begin with a chapeau, which is using the WTO more effectively here, and then end with one, which is the TRIPS agreement, the agreement on intellectual property. And in between, there's 2 or 3 specific suggestions as well. So when the WTO was created, it was meant to decrease trade barriers, and there has always been the tussle at the WTO on how minimalist that agenda should be, and everything that isn't quite that is sometimes seen to be mission creep. But the good news, sorry, I have to reach over and get my quote, is that the framers of the GATT and WTO articles did not foresee the fact that there would be exceptions. And we know that the WTO has exceptions in areas like labor, culture, and the environment to provide entry points. In fact, there's an Article 20, which allows for exceptions for health, labor, culture, and the environment. Specifically, there's an Article 20b that says exceptions will be permitted that are necessary to protect human, animal, or plant life or health. And Section G goes on to say exceptions relating to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources if such measures are made effective in conjunction with restrictions on domestic production or consumption. So the entry point is there. And what might that entry point be? And so I have a colleague, Maria Panezzi, who's been vocal on this for some time, and she and I have a paper recently on it in which we say one of the core things you might need to get at the policy side of fighting climate change is a common price on carbon. So we know that if you price carbon appropriately, it's not the only solution, but it's one way to decrease the consumption of carbon or the burning of fossil fuels, to make it more simple. This is not something that can work nationally for the same reasons that you need common labor standards. If you don't have an international standard, you create a race to the bottom. And so the scheme would be to create a global price for carbon and then use the WTO to adjust those prices at the border. So the system is called border carbon adjustments. And what that means is that if any country produces goods and exports them by pricing carbon lower than the social norm or the global standard, then just as you would have countervailing duties against dumping or against unfair labor practices, you could do the same for the unfair or unfair use of carbon. The only way this would work is if it's done centrally. It couldn't work nationally, it couldn't work regionally. But at this stage, you have a WTO that is in drift. One of the things we're looking for is a renewed mission for the organization. And it might be useful to think of a global carbon pricing scheme that is enforced through the WTO by making carbon pricing equalized across countries at the border. So that's one way to get at this. The other issue here, and I said this at the outset, is that the good news is that technological advance, in fact, is moving apace. There's 4 categories that the World Intellectual Property Organization characterizes as being directly related to fighting climate change: biofuels, solar thermal, solar photovoltaic, i.e. cells, and wind technologies. If you look at the figure, and I don't have overheads because I have a morbid fear of, Gordon, what you went through with overheads at conferences, it's basically like a hockey stick. So until about 10-ish years ago, the number of green tech patent filings was low and steady. And in the last 10 years, it's kind of gone like this. In fact, there's been an annual increase of 24% in green tech patent filings, while the global average in patent filings is 6%. So, now patent filings is not the same as effective action. I get that. It's only a metric. But as a metric, I think it's indicative of the fact that the scientists and the technology is coming through for us. It could come through even more, and so I'd like to turn to what kinds of things we could do to enhance it. Why should we? Well, number one, if you look at the numbers of who's doing the filing or where these advances are happening, it's quite remarkable. Basically, 5 countries dominate. China, by the way, in green tech is the world's leader. It typically files 50% of the patents in these areas. Japan, 15%, the US, 8-ish%, and then Korea and Germany in that same range. 5 countries, therefore, have 85 to 90% of the patent filings, and the rest of the world is filing 10%. The thing about patents, now, in biofuels, a lot of these patents are university-based, which means they might be in the public interest, but the rest of them are being filed by private sector entities or being filed effectively for profit. Now, that's not a bad thing, but what it does mean is that there's a concentration of the intellectual property that's being created in this area. And so the public policy issue for something like climate change, which has social spillovers, is that you want a system where either you increase the innovation in public entities or you have systems in place to make sure that that this IP is shared in ways that everyone can afford. And here's where I think that we can draw lessons from the agriculture and the health fields. And so my first example would be, and many of you would know this much better than I do, is the International Agricultural Research System, which, by the way, Canada had a great hand in creating and nurturing along with the US foundations back in 1969 when the first conference was held in Bellagio, and then in 71 when the system came into being, the CGIAR as it's called. So 15 institutions around the world, annual budget currently of about $1 billion. I mean, $1 billion a lot, but when you think of those figures, maybe not that much. And this was created as a response to what was then seen as a crisis in the 60s, which was famine, hunger and malnutrition. Now, these things aren't past, but the fact is, famine, hunger, and malnutrition is now much lower, and it's in small pockets where typically there's civil strife and warfare. So it's not so much an endemic issue. These 15 organizations do research, they hold patents in the public interest. The private sector often collaborates with them, and in areas like wheat, potatoes, and on, and indeed in policy, we're now much smarter than we were. And so we don't talk so much about famine, not only because of the work of the CGIAR, but largely because of the work of the CGIAR. Now imagine if you created a CGIAR for green tech. It's doable. I mean, one can never transplant the same system everywhere equally, but it's conceivable that you define 5 or 6 key challenges, you create these institutions around the world, you put scientists to work, and then you hold the patent in the public interest. So just as you could have done, and just as you have done in agriculture, we could conceive of making the fruits of IP in climate change more evenly distributed. In the process, by the way, you're creating innovation systems around the world in countries that otherwise wouldn't have them. And so that's the business about breaking out from the top 5 in that list. A second mechanism that has been used, and this one we borrow from the health field, is what are called advanced market commitments. So this is what's called a demand pull mechanism. And what this says is that there's a series of things that we would value, but the private sector is not going to produce it on its own because the market just isn't there. It's mainly poor people who want something, and they don't have the effective market power to make it profitable for firms to invest in the high-risk R&D that needs to happen to create, whether it's vaccine for X or a cure for Y. So some years ago, the Gates Foundation and 4 countries, again, proudly including Canada, created this system called the Advanced Market Commitment, where you define a problem. In this case, it was to create a pneumococcal vaccine, and say, whoever creates it under these specifications, we will purchase so many million doses at this price, therefore guaranteeing you a market for this invention, which otherwise is not going to happen. So you use public funds to create a market and therefore an incentive for the private sector to do something, which then has a social benefit. Again, one can't completely transplant equally, but it seems to me that one could use the same principle, define certain challenges that have high social spillover effects, that have high net benefits, that are not going to happen because the risk is too high unless a market pre-exists, and then create that pool of funds, make the specifications, and then have people go at it. We know that once you create the incentive, the private sector usually, and indeed the public sector, reacts quite well. So again, a thought. Is it possible to define 2 or 3 challenges in climate change and then use an advanced market commitment mechanism to do so? The third example I'd give you, again borrowed from health, is compulsory licensing. Compulsory licensing, sometimes called differential pricing, is what developing countries used to ensure that, for example, medication for HIV/AIDS, which was hugely expensive, was made available at lower prices in poorer countries. Why couldn't we think of having compulsory licensing for some of these proprietary technologies that we know are good for the environment? So you do have the social spillover. You know that at current prices, they cannot be used around the world. So it's not just a developing country issue, by the way. It can also be something implemented within developed countries. The main challenge here is, of course, you want to make sure that it's enforceable. I think you wouldn't want people to buy your technology at a low price and then sell it back in high price regimes. So yes, there are practical issues that have to be thought through, but that was the case with the HIV/AIDS medication as well. And the fact is, you know, you can have batch numbers, you can trace it. especially with digital technology and with software, you know who's using it, when and why. I mean, there's no dearth of information and monitoring systems anymore. And so you might want to think about having a compulsory licensing system for something that's absolutely crucial and that has a spillover effect, so that it's not just that I'm doing you charity. If you apply this, then as you said, my environment in the north, in Canada, or in Russia, or in Norway, also improves. And so it is, as you said, a global public good. And when you have a global public good, it makes sense to think of either selective or generic subsidies to make it happen. The fourth and final point I'll make, and I'll stop here in this question of policy reform, is the convention that we have that sort of runs most of these things I've talked about, which is TRIPS, which is the Global Intellectual Property Convention that we use. This has been in force for some decades, and what it did, or what the thinking behind it when it was first created, was to say that you can't have people invest and take risks in creating technology if, in fact, that technology is then going to be stolen or copied or used by someone else. That is a fair point. And so you have a system of patents where you said minimum standard, patents must exist for 20 years and they must be enforced and so on. And different countries were given sort of different time limits. I think it was 2016 that developing countries were supposed to meet their TRIPS requirements. Now what we find ourselves in is a different situation. Number one, we have compelling evidence that more and more protection for IP does not stimulate innovation. In fact, it inhibits innovation. And the reason for that is that the more you create proprietary knowledge, the more locked up it is. But for innovation, what you need is access to previous advances on which to build. And so the only people who can build on their advances are those who already hold IP. But they may not have the incentive, because eventually what you're creating are monopolies and oligopolies that by nature are not going to be as hungry to innovate as might be outsiders. And so I think the innovation growth nexus is changing. And think of it as a bell curve, an inverted bell curve. There's a point beyond which, up to which innovation is a good thing and stimulates, protection stimulates more innovation. Beyond that point, protection probably destimulates innovation. And my reading of that literature is that we're in that zone now. And yet, what do we see? We're not talking about sort of reforming TRIPS to make it more subtle. In fact, the lingo now is something called TRIPS Plus. And TRIPS Plus is not surprising, because where you stand depends on where you sit. The U.S. in particular holds a lot of the IP in most parts, in most fields of science. And so it would have an interest, be it culture, be it science, to want more protection for the rents that it gets from the existing IP. And so in its trade negotiations, including when it was part of TPP, it was promoting what's called TRIPS Plus, which is things like more than 20-year patent protection. Or the other one is dissuading generics from getting going. There's a 5-year period at the end when generics can simply copy and put something on the market, while TRIPS Plus includes provisions where generics have to go through the same expensive lab trials to show that their generic copy does not have health or other side effects. And so there's ways to sort of complicate the system and make TRIPS deeper when in fact what we need is an opening up of TRIPS. So let me end by simply saying this might not be the time when global cooperation is a la mode. On the other hand, there's significant pockets of I would say, creativity here. Second, these things go in phases. The 60s and perhaps the 70s were a bit of a golden age in cooperation. There's been a bit of a decline now. There's no reason to say that this won't pick up again. A lot of the things, for example, when the US pulled out of Paris Accord, it was striking how many cities and states came up and said, it doesn't matter what the feds do, we're going to stick to them. So there's subnationals can make a difference as well. Not in everything. In fact, in many of the examples I gave, it would work best if it happened as cooperation between nations. But given that that isn't likely to happen tomorrow, we can still work on some of these ideas. I mean, in the case of AMCs, you had 4 relatively minor countries and a private philanthropic foundation that came together and made a difference. There's no reason why we can't think of that in other areas. CGI, same thing. You don't need a globally friendly climate for people to come up with an international climate change research network, a la CGI, that does it. So I think the technology is moving ahead, the policy is slower, but it's still possible to make a difference, and I've given you some thoughts on how we might do so. Thank you.